All right, let's close the book on law and legislation and
Ah, thank
antitrust
goodness.
today in
Goodbye, DMA
Europe
Today.
as we welcome our new segment, DOJ
Oh
Today.
no. Oh
The
no.
U.S. Department of Justice, 15 states, and the
No,
District of
no.
Columbia sued Apple last Thursday on the grounds of anti competitive actions related to the iPhone and related products. It is a very complicated 88-page document that Jason has read. So I
Uh-huh.
read Jason's article, and we're going
Oh,
to use
good.
that, which was very good. Felt to me anyway.
Everybody
Who
out there
knows?
can just listen to Mike and it will go from the Department of Justice to me to Mike to you.
Yep, that's how it works. And we're going to use
Yep.
that as a framework for discussion today. So you broke this down to a bunch of segments, and we'll start by, if we're looking at antitrust, we start by saying there's a monopoly, right? That's how we get to this point. So the DOJ is suing Apple on the grounds of anti-competitive behavior. Is it anti-competitive or antitrust? Or are they the same?
They're antitrust. A trust is like a monopoly.
All
It's a
right.
dates back to the days of railroads and oil companies being
Wonderful.
monopolies.
Wonderful. Great. So we need to first define a monopoly. So the Department of Justice has tried to do that. A 60% share of the US smartphone market, which is what Apple has, is not a monopoly. It's not enough, right? It's not a monopoly.
Doesn't seem like it.
So they are kind of carving it up in a few ways. One, the Department of Justice is using revenue generate instead of units sold. They have created a new sub-market of smartphone called performance smartphone, which pushes Apple up to 70%. And they also accuse Apple of attempting to create a monopoly through various tactics. So even if they haven't got like 90% of the market, they're really trying to get it. Is that fair? I've just summarized your summary, but
Yeah. The idea here is they need to establish why this is a monopoly, and it's actually kind of hard. And so they have said, well, it's just in the U.S. and it's just revenue, and and if that's not good enough, it's just performance smartphones, which gets us up to 70% revenue share. And then I'd say the other thing they do that in my mind suggests that they know that their numbers aren't very strong, and they're just trying to they're trying to make their case here. At one point, they do finally get to a number that I think most people would say is verging on a monopoly, which is a number that starts at 90. And they do that by making the bold claim that 90% of the smartphone market is controlled by Apple and Google and Samsung put together, which is so amazing, right? Where they're like, haha, we got to 90 by adding in two competitors who are not part of this lawsuit. It's bananas. But the truth is, historically, what defines a monopoly is not like a number. It has to do with the power exerted over the entire market as defined, what that market is that's defined. And it also can vary based on even the regions, the circuit courts of the federal judicial system. And if you're wondering why they filed in New Jersey, this circuit court had a case where they found that a company involved in making like dentures and accessories or something had a 60-some% market share, and they said they were a monopoly because of the way that they use their power. And they undoubtedly picked this court because of that. So I'm not a lawyer. I look at this and I think it doesn't pass the sniff test of being a monopoly, but they will make some very clever, as we said before, you can argue anything. And you could say, well, Apple doesn't have a monopoly in the sense of being 90% of the market, but the power they exert over the smartphone market is such that they are behaving as a monopoly. That would be the argument. It's just, this would be easier if Apple's real market share was 70%. This would be way easier if it was 80%. And this would be, I would say, a slam dunk if it were 90%. So I think it is an issue where they really have to make the case that Apple exerts huge control over this market. And Apple's defense is going to be that it's a highly competitive market, and that everything Apple is doing is because they have brutal competition, not just in the US, but all around the world. And the more they can globalize it, the lower their market share gets, because the US is their best market.
So this is kind of interesting because it dovetails from what we were just talking about. So for me, this is like, I don't care about percentages, like me personally, because it that last point that Apple attempts to create a monopoly through various tactics, and we're going to go through those tactics that the DOJ is setting out. I think that is the key to it. That, like, Apple is trying really hard, and if they could, they would very happily take that 90% and treat it exactly the same.
Sure. Yeah, the challenge is that legal tactics by a regular company become illegal when a monopoly does them.
Yeah.
So there's this fuzzy line, and you can make the historical claim, right, that Apple's market share has actually grown a little bit, but like they are locked in a battle with Google and Android in general, and Samsung in particular in the premium category, and that this is a fierce competition, and that Apple's decisions are based on that and not based on control. Like, because in the end, it's about, is Apple just trying to take its power to reap, all these benefits, or is it doing it because it is locked in a struggle with the competition and it's competing? And that's one of the things we have to deal with. I should also say, for people who don't, have not spent any time thinking about antitrust law or aren't in the U.S., you may be saying to yourself, why does it matter? Like, they obviously have a big market share and they're very powerful, and you can put them together with Samsung and Google and get them over 90%. And really, if you look at it as iOS and Android, it's 100% essentially of the smartphone market. And that gives Apple, as one of two major players and gatekeepers, enormous control over the market, right? Which is what the EU's argument is, right? Mm-hmm. Except for this. You gotta, in order to have a lawsuit, you gotta have a law. It's gotta be illegal. They gotta do something illegal.
Yes.
And the United States has been very bad at passing new laws about things like...
The DMA is a law. And then they wrote the law and then said you have to comply with it.
Yeah, and they wrote it with the big tech companies in mind. The Sherman Antitrust Act is what the Department of Justice is using. It is well over 100 years old. It was written for the era where there were huge monopolies in things like, in cutting-edge industries like trains and oil. But this is the thing is, that's all they got. That's all they got. And monopoly law and antitrust law has evolved over time, and there are lots of complex definitions of it now, because you have to kind of evolve it. Otherwise, all you're going to get is the Rockefellers and the Stanfords of the world, right? The from the 19th and early 20th centuries, and so it has evolved, but this is what they have to use. So if you're wondering, like, why are we even arguing about if Apple's a monopoly? Why can't we just talk about Apple's behavior? The fact is that if the Department of Justice can't definitively prove that Apple is behaving as a monopoly, they have no case, because Apple's not being accused of doing anything that's illegal in general. Mm-hmm. They're being accused of doing things that are illegal for people with monopoly power to do. And that's the huge difference.
And in my opinion,
everything is about the monopoly.
In my opinion, I mean, it's not just my opinion, one of the worst things that happened here is Epic took Apple to court, because there is nothing in here about the App Store, right? Like, about Apple's control of the App Store, because Epic and Apple have already had this fight and Epic lost. And I feel like if the Department of Justice could have included in here things about the App Store, then we'd be talking about a different kettle of fish. Yeah.
I mean, there's stuff in there. They mention it, but they are steering away from it. And this is, okay, there's a lot of talk about this. This has been out there for a little while now. And there are people who are like, aha, take it to big tech. And there are other people who are like, this is ridiculous. This is such a stupid thing. It's a waste of everybody's time. I would say my frustration with this is that there are lots of things Apple does that I don't like and that I think are questionable in terms of their behavior, in terms of things that I think that Apple is doing that seem very unfair, and that they're using their power and their control of their platform to be anti-competitive. Mm-hmm. There are lots of examples of that. Very few of them are in this lawsuit.
Yeah.
And part of it is that already in the Epic Games case, a lot of this stuff was sort of run up the flagpole and found to be not super convincing. Doesn't mean they can't make those arguments again. And this legal panel could say, actually, we do believe those arguments. But it makes it harder. And I think it also suggests, given some of the weak arguments that are in this first filing, I would say anything you don't see in here is probably not because they forgot about it. It's because it felt even weaker to them to allege. And as a result, I'm frustrated by this because I look at this and I think it's kind of misguided. You missed a huge opportunity. And some of the stuff that you are picking is dumb, right? Like, is this the best you can do is sort of how I walk away from this. Because I don't think that there aren't any competitive urges that Apple has that they have been exercising over more than a decade. But two things. One, is it illegal? And that's on Congress, right? That's on the lawmakers to make laws about is it legal or not, as opposed to just feels real icky, you know. And so, like, is it illegal or not? And then the other thing is the Department of Justice, like, do they even get it? Is my other concern is it's people remember when we talked about the AI pin, the humane AI pin?
Yeah.
And one of the things that we picked out about it was there's this, it's a cool demo and it's a cool product. And I think it's actually very instructive that if you don't have a smartphone platform that you own that's dominant, it's very hard for you to even make a presence in the market. Which again, it's not illegal, but I think it's troubling about where the market is now with the two huge companies that control it. But the big thing about the Humane AI pen was also that their whole thing is sort of like, isn't it great? You can be freed from your smartphone. And you and I both were talking about how people like their phones, right? Like they're looking at them all the time. They like them. There's no, I've yet to see one of those, you know, like those late night commercials that are like, oh, I'm tired of opening cans. I hate it. I open cans all day. And somebody's like, I've got a can opener for you, right? It's a little like that, which is like, oh, I'm tired of looking at my phone all the time. There's all these games and I can scroll in social media. I wish, help me AI pin, right? That doesn't exist. And I think that about this lawsuit too, which is the lawsuit has a real tenor like people don't like the iPhone, when in fact customer satisfaction, as Tim Cook would tell us, very high on the iPhone. People love the iPhone. They love it. And there is an undercurrent in this suit of this idea, because one of the things that they're really trying to challenge is lock-in, the idea that Apple traps its customers in its ecosystem and it can't get out. And there is no denying the fact that Apple sees lock-in as a benefit.
Yeah.
And Apple likes lock-in.
And
Apple likes making it
so
stickiness.
much discovery, like documents and emails that
Sure.
confirm that part.
Of executives saying, yeah, we love it. We love it.
Why would we? Of course they do.
Why would we make it easier to switch to our competition?
All
which is,
businesses
again,
do
not
this.
illegal if you're not a monopoly.
But Apple's just very good at it.
But the tenor of the way the document is written is very much like, aha, through nefarious means, Apple has trapped people in their ecosystem. They don't want to be there anymore. They want to escape, but they can't. They've been trapped. And it really has this whiff of that classic argument that people who buy Apple hardware or Apple products in general are just dupes of marketing and coolness. And exactly. And then they're trapped. And then they're just harvested for all their cash by Apple. And it's like both of these. So Apple making decisions that enable lock-in and making their ecosystem sticky is a thing, right? But when I read about it in this case, I think to myself, is your end argument that people don't want to be on the iPhone, but they're stuck there? Because I don't think that's actually true, right? Like, I think it's not a prison.
But they can make the argument that because of Apple's actions, people can't even dare to think, right? Like, that's the argument they can make. Yes, and this is what something you and I have talked about a lot here too, which is I always have thought Apple should have more confidence in itself. And yes. I know people are, what do you mean? Apple's very arrogant. It's like, yeah, but Apple, we did that episode where it's like they own the field, they own the refs. Mm-hmm. And it's like, why compete is Apple's attitude. It's like, why compete if we don't have to? And I think Apple does believe that their products are superior, but they also believe that they shouldn't have to compete, because why? Why bother? And a lot of these regulatory exercises we're going through here are
those groups saying, one by lawsuit, by regulation, whatever, saying no, you need to actually compete on the merits, which I think is funny because I think Apple competes fine on the merits. And in some areas where they don't compete on the merits, I think it's true that they would work harder if they had to compete. Again, is that illegal or not depends on if they're a monopoly, depends on a bunch of other things. But it is, they kind of bring this on themselves because what they're doing is saying, we want it to be sticky, we want lock-in, because why wouldn't we? And as a result, that's evidence of them saying we don't want competition, which is not great if you're in an antitrust lawsuit.
I just, we're gonna get into some of the details here, but like there is just like a thing for me where it's like I don't think a company can make $22 billion a quarter and not expect to be regulated.
Right. Yeah.
This was gonna happen. It's just happening this way.
I mean, one of my pet theories is always that Apple's whole corporate culture is based on when they were the little guy who was about to go out of business, going up against enormous adversaries who had monopoly power, and that they were just trying to survive, and that they still have that attitude, even though the shoe was on the other foot now. And I think you see that in stuff like this, where if you and one of your competitors
God, I so grossly
control
said that wrong. Let me say $90 billion a quarter. Sorry, not 20. That was just one product, is what I was thinking of.
I mean, let's break it down. And again, this is not about law. This is just about like common sense, right? Smartphone is basically required for every human on planet Earth.
Yeah.
And there's only two kinds.
Yeah.
Google and Apple.
Yeah.
Again, I'm sure next year is the year of Linux in the pocket, but like really,
AI in the bin.
and I know there's different Androids in China and stuff,
two.
but
there's two.
There's two platforms.
That's what you've got.
There's two platforms here for the most important product in the world, essentially, most important tech product in the world. Do we not think that if there are only two, that they have enormous amounts of power over the human race? And do we not think that perhaps governments might want to have a say about how they perform some aspects of their business? I think it's not unreasonable to say that.
And also,
the challenge
when there are
is,
two and one of them has more than half, right?
Yeah.
That's the problem.
And in the U.S., they do have more than half. But the problem is the governments don't work on vibes; they work on laws. And in the U.S., there are not a lot of laws that directly address this stuff. So they gotta go with something like the Sherman Antitrust Act, which has been used against Microsoft. Anyway, so this is where we are. I think you and I have come back to one of my initial points, which is feels like there's something here, and this doesn't feel like it's it. But this is what we got.
But it might be though. Like
maybe
it might be enough, right? Like it might be enough because let's go through some of these things.
Yeah, I was going to say it might be enough in the sense that it might spur Apple to make changes that are substantial.
It might be enough for a judge to agree with.
Sure. Depending on the details, absolutely.
Because
let's
we have
dive
all of these
into it.
points, and I saw someone say this, and I thought that it was a really good argument. Like some of these points seem strange, unless maybe they have a lot of evidence that makes them make sense, right? Where like you can say, look, Apple does this thing, we know it because here's the emails. One of them is suppressing cross-platform technologies. The idea that Apple makes it harder for developers to release software that works the same on iOS and Android, therefore making it harder for users to switch and know that they would have a comparable experience if they had a different phone. The Department of Justice cite that some of these things that are suppressed are cloud streaming games, third-party messaging apps not being able to receive incoming SMSs, so you are pushed into iMessage, which I actually thought was enlightening. I was like,
it's an unexpected argument, but the argument is basically Apple built iMessage on the fact that it was the default message receiver on the platform.
That is a super strong argument to me. Right? They put their messaging service in the SMS app.
Exactly.
Smartwatches other than the Apple Watch not being able to be fully featured, digital wallets, and the one that is the weirdest to me, super apps. Super apps are mostly popular in Asia, and there are a few different ones. WeChat is often cited, but WhatsApp is actually one really in India, especially, where it's essentially
there's like a Tata something super app in India too, but they're
where
very popular.
One app where you do loads of stuff. So one app where you message, you have payments, you can order food, you can order cars, right? Like it's a whole thing.
They build little mini apps. They basically build a platform that is the app, and then they have little mini apps inside it that they control. And so you end up in a situation in China where one of the things about the Chinese market, and I know we talk about this when we do the quarterly stuff here, is that in China, if everything you do is in WeChat, then you can go to an Android phone, and as long as there's WeChat, which there is, you can do everything there too. And you can go to iPhone, and there's WeChat, so you do everything there. And this is the whole cross-platform thing. What the Department of Justice is trying to say is Apple makes it hard to switch, and that is an anti-competitive action, and it should be easier to switch. And I think there are, if you try to unravel that, it gets really weird, because I think that behind it is a technological naivety about platforms being different, and the idea that we're not going to say all software must be developed with the same APIs, right? Like that's bizarre. And yet, if they're different, the more different they are, the harder it is to switch between them. Also, I would argue that, if I were to switch from iOS to Android today, I would lose my Apple Watch because it's not compatible. But I could replicate everything else I do on Android, right? So the cost of switching, I'm a little bit skeptical of, but I think it's an interesting lens for them to view this situation, which is to say how easy it is to switch. And in China, it's very easy to switch. Now, the problem with that is that there's another monopoly, which is the super app,
That's the
which
weirdest
is itself
part
a
to me.
monopoly.
I can't believe that the Department of Justice, in an antitrust case, is asking for Uber to be the place where I live my life, which is essentially what I would have, right?
But here's the idea, Mike. The idea, and this comes in somewhere else, which is the whole argument in this document, which is that the only reason we're here today is because the DOJ sued Microsoft, which something big question mark allowed Apple to flourish, which is not true. It's a laugh. It is them patting themselves on the back. But if you view it through the lens of that, then the super app thing, you could say, oh well, this is great because it'll give them work. For the next decade, when a super app becomes a monopoly, they can sue them. They can sue them. Great.
The Department of Justice say that Apple have total control. They exert power over the platform to limit developers and users.
Yeah,
can't argue with that one.
No, I mean that's right. Not a bad. So yeah, cross-platform, total control are, I think, the and lock-in. Right. Those are the big arguments.
New products that work with each other, and they keep trying to go into new markets. And over time, they will just do that more and more and more until they can try and control all of the stuff in technology.
And that is definitively, I would say, the defining characteristic of an illegal monopoly is that you have a huge power base in one area, and then from there you can exert it elsewhere. And your competitors can't compete elsewhere with you because of your base in your monopoly, because it's very hard to compete with somebody who's got that level of power. And so with Microsoft, the argument was Microsoft wasn't allowing browser competition because it had operating system dominance. And they lost that case, basically. They changed how they did it, and they had to unbundle IE, and all of those things happened. And then Apple came along. So look, hooray. So that's one of the challenges here is these are they using that power in a narrowly defined monopoly to, I mean, the smartwatch thing is a good example where, like, what they're not saying, what the DOJ is not saying really is Apple not bringing the Apple Watch to Android is monopolistic, right? Like that's a very weird argument to make, to say if you don't support other platforms, you're bad. Like, it's illegal to release it for only your own platform. It's not what they're saying. What they're saying,
though, that Garmin doesn't have an API, right, to be able to get messages.
And there's arguments that there is that to some degree, and I want to see the evidence. But the argument that I think has more resonance, if it's true, is Apple, and it sounds like something Apple would do, right? Which is Apple built a whole bunch of APIs for the Apple Watch so that the Apple Watch would work well. And I don't think anybody would say that is fundamentally bad. I think people would, I mean, maybe there's somebody at the Department of Justice, but I think it's a reasonable person would say Apple innovating with its own product and building a whole bunch of stuff to let its own product work is not inherently bad. The challenge that the DOJ sees here is, and I don't know whether it's at the time it ships or within a reasonable amount of time, is Apple built all that stuff for the Apple Watch, and the argument goes, and the allegation is, that other smartwatches try to get access to all of that close tie-in with the system that allows them to function at the same way that they do on Android, and they can't. And that's their argument, is that Apple, and then it goes to cross-platform and lock-in by saying, essentially, if you want to use a smartwatch on an iPhone, you can only use Apple's because the others aren't very good, because they're being anti-competitive. And, of course, it doesn't work on the other platform. So if you switch, you're not just buying a new phone, you have to buy a new watch now. And that's all about lock-in and anti-competitiveness. That's the argument that they're making. And I think, again, the idea that at some point Apple needs to let other smartwatches work on the iPhone. They can't just make it that the Apple Watch works the best. That if somebody wanted to put in the investment, if Google wanted to put the investment to have one of the Google smartwatches work as well with iOS as the Apple Watch does, they should be able to do that. That's the argument.
They also say that Apple uses security for convenience. I'm going to read a quote from you, which includes a quote from the Department of Justice.
Yes, thank you.
It calls Apple's privacy and security justifications an elastic shield that can stretch or contract to serve Apple's interests. Yes.
Yeah.
Go off, DOJ. Right?
Yeah.
They do this.
They do. They absolutely do. And the problem is, I mean, elastic shield's actually really great, because implication in there, this is my favorite line in the whole document. The implication there is, it stretches or contracts to serve its interests. It's not, what it's not saying is, Apple says, like we've heard these troll arguments before, right? Which is like, well, Apple says that privacy and security matter, but it don't really. All that matters to them is money. It's like, that's not true. Privacy and security absolutely matter to Apple, and it's absolutely a priority for them. It is also true that Apple's behavior is not only prioritizing privacy and security. It also is about their own interests, about money, maybe about lock-in. Those things are also in there. And once you let those things creep in, it makes it easier for, say, the Department of Justice to point at it and say, you're hiding behind security. Like we said about the rules in Europe for letting somebody into the store, where they're like, oh, well, yeah, you can do sideloading. You just have to spend 2 years in a penalty box and find a way to get 1 million downloads in Europe. And then you're free to do what you want, right? And we have to do this because of platform security. And it's like, well, there are probably other ways to answer that problem, but you've decided to make it about platform security. There are, what I would say is, like, it's not consistent. There are examples where Apple is doing features that benefit privacy and security, that it's entirely about privacy and security. There are cases where it's mostly about privacy and security, but they also look at it and say, oh, we could also make some money here. And it has the added effect of having a little lock-in. It's good for us. And they do it. And then there are other ones where they talk about the privacy and security, and you look at it and you go, really? Because it seems to me like your real motivator here is that this gives you more power or control or money, or some combination of those. And that's been, and again, they have nobody but themselves to blame, because they muddy these waters. They muddy these waters with their business decisions.
And it is, like, one of the things that you cannot avoid from this, and I think one of the things that's going to continually come back to bite Apple, is they are always talking about the tight integration between hardware and software. That is what they care about. They promote heavily on this.
Mm-hmm.
Is it now said that this is illegal to do? I don't know. But the fact that they have been so hell-bent on this idea that only their stuff can work together, that's now going to become a problem for them.
This is one of the more existential threats to Apple, is this idea that Apple's whole idea of integrated devices is actually illegal, given how successful they are on the iPhone.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that that's quite right, though. I think there's a model here that's in clear view, and I don't know the details, but, like, the Apple Watch is a good example. We could use others. Apple does this thing where they announce a new product, And it's like, I mean, AirPods are like this too,
Yeah.
right? Where it's like, oh, well, Bluetooth wasn't good enough, so we invented a new thing, and it makes our headphones way better than anybody else's headphones on our platform.
Yep.
I don't think that is in any way illegal. That's Apple's business model. It's how they make good products.
Yep.
The challenge, and this might make the whole thing untenable, which is the danger for Apple. The challenge is, if you read that as being, we built a bunch of stuff that only we ever get access to, and it means that our product in this category will always be better than any of the other products in this category, and you can buy other earbuds if you really want to, but they're never going to be as good as ours. So you might as well just buy ours.
I have a
right?
good example. Find My. The Find My network. So they built their own privacy tracking device. So their tracking device, right, the AirTag. But Apple knew this was going to be a problem for them because they were already in trouble about Tile, right?
Right.
So they created a system where you can make a product like this and apply, and you would be in the Find My network, which benefits from the majority of features that an AirTag has. So they've shown they can do this.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, the latest example is the journaling app, which includes all sorts of things that are about your phone watching what you do, what music you play, what podcasts you listen to, where you've been, what photos you've taken. A lot of stuff that has to happen on device because, it's monitoring you, right? But it's your device and it's monitoring you because it's with you all the time. And then you decide what you want to do with it. And what Apple, in the past, I would argue what Apple would have done is announce the journaling app and release it, and only Apple's app would have access to all that data. And instead what they did is they built an API, and they released an app that uses the API, and they opened that API up to other apps to get that same data. And I know there's details there. I don't want to get into it. My point is, this is the kind of thing that is the model potentially, which is, so you do the Apple Watch. The question is, what's Apple's burden to allow others access to this stuff? I think the argument would be, Apple, you cannot create private APIs, essentially, for your integrations that no one else gets access to so that you can exert your platform ownership power to prevent any competition on the platform. Now, there are a lot of arguments inside there, which is, does that mean that every time, because the way that would hamper innovation is saying to Apple, every time you do anything innovative at all, you immediately need to release a detailed API spec and have everything be public so that somebody else can come in very quickly and write to all of those APIs. And there are cases where that's probably really fair, right? Like you're a third party who's been trying to serve this market. I mean, I don't know, you're Pebble back in the day for smartwatches. You're day one, or you're an app. You're an app that's desperately wanted an API for something, and then Apple decides to make an app like your app, and now there's an API for it. The least they could do is let you also access the API. So the question is, like, does that have to happen when they ship it? Because that's going to increase the burden on Apple. It would be the equivalent. I mean, this is the wrong example because it was in the early days of the iPhone, but it'd be the equivalent of saying you can't ship the iPhone until you have an app store. It's that kind of thing, right? Where they're like, no, we need time. We don't even have the developer tools built yet. We ship the product. We can do the product, but doing the developer documentation and all those things, it's going to take more time. We still are having to work on that. It's like, okay, fair enough. That's where we are with stuff like this, which is it's probably okay for Apple. It's okay for Apple to innovate. It's probably okay for Apple to ship a product that does some amazing new things. But I think what the argument would be is it's not okay for Apple to take all of the extra connective tissue that they built that makes their integrated product work and keep it to themselves as the platform owner so that no one else can make a competitive product and have access to that same stuff. And therefore, everybody who uses an iPhone is really going to be predisposed to buy AirPods because AirPods work better. And that's I think that's the biggest potential danger and change, and why this thing talks about private APIs. I think is like to me that's a huge thing because that's the one that blares out to me as being anti-competitive, which is it's not about Apple innovating. It's about Apple innovating and keeping all of the innovations on the hardware side as special to the platform owner, leading to a situation where nobody can compete with a platform owner on its platform anywhere in any other product. And this goes back to our complaints about things like the Kindle books and stuff like that, where it's like Apple has built a product on its platform and made it impossible for anyone to compete with them. That seems anti-competitive to me, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's where it bugs me. And some of that's in here. Not all of it, but some of it's in here.
So obviously Apple's going to fight this. They've released a statement. This is from 9 to 5 Mac. We believe this lawsuit is wrong on the facts and the law, and we will vigorously defend against it. And this is going to take years. There'll be lots of hearings. We'll learn lots of interesting things, maybe.
Microsoft took a decade.
Yep.
Microsoft took a decade.
There'll be lots of documents released from discovery process, which will be fascinating. I'll look forward to reading through
A lot of emails from people who shouldn't have been using email.
Yep. Yes. If there's one thing the last few years have taught anyone, you shouldn't use email, but what you also shouldn't do is say, let's not use email, because Google did that, and then they lost. So everyone, you need to say in person to everyone, don't write anything down, and then you end up in a problem where no one can work because nothing's written down.
Yeah, I know.
Well, write it all down on paper.
That's the trick.
Hey, Apple, I have some notepads to say if you want them.
I don't know I don't know how to break this to you, Mike, but that's how this whole thing started. Is paper is subpoenable.
But then you can shred it. Just like, just write it all down on paper, shred it at the end of the day.
The upgrade program does not endorse the idea of destroying evidence.
Well, it's like Schrodinger's evidence, right? At what point is something evidence? How do you know it's evidence? You know?
Yeah, when they sue you.
But then it's gone. You shredded it.
Yeah, maybe.
So we're probably going to need a new name for this segment, because now we have DOJ today and DMA today.
I don't want two different things based on jurisdictions, and this doesn't help us when there's something in Korea that happens or in Japan.
At first, it didn't seem like we didn't know we were going to need it. You know what I mean? So answers on a postcard. Go to upgradefeedback.com. Give us your suggestions. I asked ChatGPT for some suggestions, Jason.
Oh, no.
Well, I just thought it might be an interest. You know, you never know what you're going to get. So, but what I wanted specifically was I wanted something with up, right? Up something. Because we've done that in the past. The best that it gave me, which I don't like, but the best that it gave me was uphold. But I don't like it.
No.